In the suffocating heat of a makeshift field hospital, where the smell of antiseptic mixed with blood and desperation, Sarah Mitchell carefully cleaned her hands for the 100th time that day. To everyone around her, she was just another dedicated nurse, gentle with patients, efficient with medical supplies, and always the first to volunteer for the dangerous night shifts near the front lines. But beneath her scrubs and behind her compassionate smile lay secrets that could shatter everything her colleagues believed about the quiet woman who never spoke about her past. When the first explosion shook the hospital walls and enemy soldiers breached the perimeter, those secrets would emerge in ways that would leave everyone questioning who Sarah Mitchell really was, and what kind of training transforms an ordinary nurse into something far more lethal than anyone could imagine. The truth was about to surface in the most violent way possible. Sarah Mitchell moved through the field hospital with the practiced efficiency of someone who had seen too much pain and learned to compartmentalize it. The morning sun cast long shadows across the canvas walls of the medical facility, located just 15 miles from the active combat zone in eastern Syria. She checked her watch, 0630 hours, and began her routine inspection of medical supplies, counting bandages and checking expiration dates on morphine vials with methodical precision. The other nurses had grown accustomed to Sarah's quiet nature over the past 8 months. She rarely spoke about her life before arriving at the Doctors Without Borders facility, deflecting personal questions with gentle smiles and redirected conversations about patient care. Dr. Elena Vasquez, the head physician, often remarked that Sarah seemed to anticipate medical needs before they arose, moving with an almost military precision that made her invaluable during emergency situations. "Sarah, we've got incoming wounded from the morning patrol," called out Marcus Chun, a fellow nurse from Boston who had been trying unsuccessfully to draw Sarah into conversations about home. ETA 15 minutes. Looks like shrapnel injuries and possible internal bleeding. Sarah nodded without looking up from her inventory. Her hands moved with steady confidence as she prepared the trauma bay, laying out surgical instruments in perfect order. She had done this countless times before, though none of her colleagues knew that her medical training extended far beyond nursing school. The muscle memory of emergency medicine ran deeper than they could imagine, carved into her reflexes through experiences she could never share. The helicopter's rotors announced the arrival of casualties before the aircraft became visible. Sarah watched through the small window as the dust cloud approached, her trained eyes automatically assessing wind direction and landing conditions. She noticed things others missed: the slight deviation in the pilot's approach pattern, the way the aircraft favored its left side, suggesting possible mechanical issues or battle damage. "Prep for 3 wounded," Dr. Vasquez announced as she burst through the entrance. 1 critical, 2 stable, but requiring immediate attention. The first stretcher came through the door carrying a young soldier, barely 18, with shrapnel wounds across his chest and abdomen. Sarah took one look at the injury pattern and immediately began calculating blood loss rates and potential organ damage. Her assessment was automatic, instantaneous, and far more comprehensive than what her nursing credentials would suggest. As she worked alongside Dr. Vasquez to stabilize the patient, Sarah found herself slipping into a rhythm that felt both familiar and dangerous. Her hands moved with surgical precision, anticipating the doctor's needs before they were voiced. She managed 4 lines while simultaneously monitoring vitals and preparing for potential complications that wouldn't be obvious to most medical personnel. "How did you know to prep the chest tube kit?" Dr. Vasquez asked during a brief lull in the emergency treatment. "I hadn't even made that assessment yet." Sarah paused for just a moment, realizing she had revealed more expertise than her cover story allowed. The breathing pattern and chest wall movement suggested pneumothorax, she replied carefully. "I've seen similar cases before." It wasn't exactly a lie, though the circumstances where she had gained such experience remained buried in classified files. The truth was that Sarah Mitchell wasn't just a nurse. Her real name was Chief Petty Officer Sarah Elena Rodriguez, and until 2 years ago, she had been one of the most highly trained combat medics in the Navy SEALs Special Operations Unit. The second wounded soldier required surgery for a complex abdominal injury. As Dr. Vasquez worked, Sarah found herself mentally running through advanced trauma protocols that went far beyond civilian emergency medicine. She caught herself before suggesting procedures that would raise questions about her background. But the internal tension of holding back her full capabilities created a constant underlying stress. During the afternoon break, Sarah walked the perimeter of the hospital compound. To anyone watching, she was simply getting fresh air and stretching her legs. In reality, she was conducting a security assessment that had become second nature during her years of special operations training. She noted sight lines, potential defensive positions, and weaknesses in the facility's protection measures. The hospital was positioned in a valley between two low hills, providing some natural protection from direct fire but creating vulnerability to elevated attack positions. The single-access road made evacuation difficult, but could be easily defended with proper positioning. The local security consisted of 6 Syrian army soldiers who seemed more focused on staying comfortable than maintaining effective watch rotations. These observations troubled Sarah more than she let on. Intelligence reports she had access to through her previous connections suggested increased enemy activity in the region, but sharing this information would require explanations she couldn't provide. Her current identity as a civilian nurse didn't allow for knowledge of military intelligence assessments. That evening, as the hospital settled into its nighttime routine, Sarah volunteered for the overnight watch. She told Dr. Vasquez that she preferred the quiet hours for catching up on patient charts. But the reality was that her sleep patterns had never fully adjusted to civilian life. The hypervigilance that had kept her alive during dozens of covert operations made peaceful sleep nearly impossible. As she made her rounds checking on patients, Sarah's enhanced hearing picked up sounds that others missed. The subtle change in the guards' conversation patterns suggested nervousness. Vehicle movements on distant roads created acoustic signatures that spoke of military activity rather than civilian traffic. These were the kinds of details that had made her invaluable during reconnaissance missions. But now they only served to increase her anxiety about threats she couldn't officially acknowledge. Around 0200 hours, while updating a patient's medication chart, Sarah noticed Marcus approaching her station. He moved with unusual caution, glancing around as if to ensure they weren't being observed. "Can I ask you something?" Marcus said quietly, settling into the chair beside her desk. Sarah looked up from her paperwork, keeping her expression neutral. "Of course. You're not really just a nurse, are you?" Marcus's voice carried a mixture of curiosity and concern. "I mean, you obviously are a nurse, and a damn good one. But there's something else. The way you handle trauma situations, the way you seem to know things before they happen." Sarah felt a familiar tightness in her chest that came with maintaining her cover story under scrutiny. "I've had some additional training in emergency medicine," she replied carefully. "Before coming here, I worked in some challenging environments." "What kind of environments?" The question hung in the air between them. Sarah knew that Marcus was intelligent and observant, qualities that made him an excellent nurse, but also made him dangerous to her carefully maintained fiction. She had grown fond of him over the months they had worked together, but fondness couldn't override operational security considerations. "Places where medical care had to be provided under difficult conditions," Sarah answered, keeping her tone conversational while providing no real information. "Sometimes you learn to adapt quickly when lives are on the line." Marcus studied her face in the dim light of the hospital's emergency lighting system. "Sarah, I don't know what you're running from or hiding from, but I want you to know that whatever it is, it doesn't change how much we value having you here. You've saved lives that might have been lost without your skills." His words created an unexpected emotional response that Sarah had to work to suppress. The isolation of maintaining a false identity, especially when surrounded by people who showed her genuine care and respect, was one of the most challenging aspects of her current situation. She wanted to tell Marcus the truth, to explain that she wasn't running from anything but rather trying to build something new after a military career that had asked too much and given too little in return. Instead, she smiled and returned to her paperwork. "Thank you, Marcus. That means a lot." As Marcus returned to his own duties, Sarah reflected on the path that had brought her to this remote hospital. 2 years ago, after completing her final classified mission, she had made the decision to leave the Navy and pursue a different kind of service. The transition from special operations to civilian nursing had required careful planning and the creation of a new identity that would allow her to use her medical skills without revealing her military background. 3 weeks had passed since Sarah's conversation with Marcus, and the hospital had settled into what felt like a sustainable routine despite the ongoing conflict in the region. The steady flow of wounded soldiers and civilians created a rhythm that the medical staff had learned to navigate with professional efficiency, though Sarah continued to notice details that suggested the security situation was deteriorating faster than anyone wanted to acknowledge. The morning briefing with Dr. Vasquez had become a daily ritual that Sarah both appreciated and dreaded. The head physician shared information about expected casualties, supply concerns, and general security updates from the local military liaison. But Sarah's experience allowed her to read between the lines of these reports in ways that revealed a much more concerning picture than what was being officially communicated. "We're expecting a reduction in military patrols through our sector," Dr. Vasquez announced to the assembled medical staff. "The Syrian army is consolidating forces for operations in other areas, which should actually reduce the number of wounded soldiers we'll be treating." Sarah recognized this euphemistic language immediately. Military forces weren't being consolidated for offensive operations elsewhere. They were being withdrawn because intelligence suggested this area was about to become untenable. The reduction in patrols wasn't a strategic redeployment. It was an abandonment that left the hospital and surrounding civilian population largely unprotected. After the briefing, Sarah made her way to the communications room, where she routinely checked medical supply requests and patient transfer schedules. But today, she had a different purpose that required accessing information systems in ways that her nursing credentials didn't officially allow. Over the months of working at the hospital, Sarah had carefully observed the communication procedures and security protocols. Her military background had taught her to assess and understand information systems regardless of whether she had official access, and she had identified ways to monitor regional intelligence reports without leaving traces of unauthorized access. Using techniques learned during her special operations training, Sarah accessed encrypted communication channels that provided real-time intelligence assessments for the region. What she discovered confirmed her worst fears. Enemy forces were planning a coordinated attack on medical facilities throughout the area, believing that targeting hospitals would undermine morale and force military withdrawals. The intelligence indicated that the attack on their facility was planned for some time within the next 72 hours. The enemy had conducted reconnaissance and knew the hospital's defensive weaknesses, patient capacity, and staff schedules. They also knew that international medical facilities were typically lightly defended and that successful attacks would generate significant media attention. Sarah's heart raced as she processed this information. Every instinct from her military training demanded immediate action, evacuation procedures, defensive preparations, and coordination with military forces for protection. But taking any of these actions would require explanations about how a civilian nurse had obtained classified intelligence information. The ethical dilemma created by her situation was almost overwhelming. She had information that could save the lives of her colleagues and the patients under their care, but using that information would expose her true identity and potentially compromise ongoing intelligence operations that might save even more lives in the broader conflict. As she left the communications room, Sarah noticed that her hands were trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the adrenaline response that came with recognizing imminent danger. Her body was preparing for combat in ways that her current identity couldn't acknowledge or act upon. During the lunch break, Sarah approached Dr. Vasquez with carefully chosen words that she hoped would prompt appropriate action without revealing her sources. "Doctor, I've been thinking about our security situation," Sarah began, keeping her tone conversational. "Given the recent changes in military activity in the area, do you think we should review our emergency evacuation procedures?" Dr. Vasquez looked up from her meal with mild surprise. "That's an interesting concern, Sarah. What prompted you to think about evacuation procedures?" "Just general caution," Sarah replied carefully. "Medical facilities can become targets during conflicts, and it might be worth ensuring that our staff knows how to respond if we need to move patients quickly." The doctor's expression became more serious as she considered Sarah's suggestion. "You're right that we should review our emergency procedures. I'll speak with the local military liaison about updating our security assessment. Sarah nodded, though she knew that any official military assessment would take days to complete and might not be shared with civilian medical personnel until it was too late. She had planted the seed of concern in Dr. Vasquez's mind, but the timeline for official action wouldn't match the urgency of the threat. That afternoon, while conducting her regular rounds, Sarah began making discreet preparations that she hoped would improve the hospital's chances of survival if an attack occurred. She repositioned medical supplies to ensure that critical materials were distributed rather than concentrated in easily destroyed central storage areas. She noted the locations of all communication equipment and identified backup power sources that might function if primary systems were damaged. Most importantly, she began observing her colleagues with new eyes, assessing their likely responses to crisis situations, and identifying those who might be most capable of maintaining calm under extreme pressure. This evaluation felt uncomfortably similar to mission planning from her special operations days, but the alternative was to remain passive while people she cared about walked unknowingly toward danger. Marcus approached her during the evening shift change with an expression that suggested he had been thinking about their previous conversation. "Sarah, can I talk to you privately?" he asked, glancing around to ensure they wouldn't be overheard. They walked to a quiet area near the hospital's generator shed, where the mechanical noise would mask their conversation from casual listeners. "I've been watching you over the past few weeks," Marcus said quietly. "The way you've been moving around the hospital, checking things that don't seem related to patient care. And today, when you suggested reviewing evacuation procedures, it felt like you knew something specific rather than just being generally cautious." Sarah felt the familiar tension that came with having her cover questioned by someone with good observational skills. "I'm not sure what you mean, Marcus." "I think you do," he replied gently. "Look, I don't know what your background is, and I'm not asking you to tell me anything you can't share. But if you know something about a threat to this hospital, people's lives might depend on whatever action we can take." The directness of Marcus's approach created a decision point that Sarah had hoped to avoid. She could continue maintaining her cover and hope that official channels would provide adequate warning, or she could trust someone who had shown genuine concern for their colleagues' safety. "Marcus, if I were to share concerns about security that I couldn't officially explain, would you be willing to help prepare for potential problems without asking questions about my sources?" Marcus studied her face in the dim light cast by the generator shed's security lamp. "Are we talking about imminent danger?" "We're talking about the possibility of imminent danger," Sarah replied carefully, "and the need for preparations that might seem unnecessary unless you understood the full context." "What kind of preparations?" Sarah took a deep breath, knowing that she was about to cross a line that would make it impossible to return to the simple fiction of being just another civilian nurse. "We need to ensure that medical supplies are distributed so they can't all be destroyed in a single attack. We need to identify defensive positions within the hospital that could protect patients and staff during an assault. We need to prepare communication protocols that would work if our primary systems were compromised. And we need to do all of this without creating panic or raising questions about why such preparations are necessary." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications of what Sarah had described. "You're talking about preparing for a military attack on the hospital." "I'm talking about prudent emergency planning," Sarah replied, though they both understood that this was a distinction without a meaningful difference. "How long do we have?" "I don't know for certain, but I think we should assume that any preparations need to be completed within the next day or two." Marcus nodded slowly. "What do you need me to do?" Over the next hour, Sarah outlined a series of preparations that would improve the hospital's chances of surviving an attack while maintaining plausible explanations for each action. Medical supplies would be redistributed as part of an inventory reorganization. Staff would receive updated emergency procedures during regular training sessions. Communication equipment would be tested and backup protocols established under the pretense of routine maintenance. Each preparation was designed to appear normal to casual observation while actually creating defensive capabilities that might mean the difference between life and death if the hospital came under attack. As they worked together to implement these preparations, Sarah found herself slipping into the leadership role that had been natural during her military career. She provided specific instructions, anticipated problems, and coordinated activities in ways that made their efforts far more effective than they would have been with conventional civilian emergency planning. Marcus followed her lead without question, though she could see in his expression that he was filing away observations about her knowledge and capabilities. His trust was both gratifying and concerning, as it represented another person who would eventually demand explanations about her true background. The attack came at 0347 hours, just as Sarah's intelligence analysis had predicted. She was in the middle of checking on a patient with pneumonia when the first explosion shattered the pre-dawn silence, followed immediately by the distinctive crack of automatic weapons fire. Her body reacted before her mind had fully processed the situation, dropping low, assessing cover positions, and calculating threat vectors with the instantaneous precision that had kept her alive through countless combat situations. The hospital's emergency lighting flickered and died as the generator shed took a direct hit from what sounded like a rocket-propelled grenade. In the sudden darkness, Sarah heard the confused voices of her colleagues mixing with the terrified cries of patients and the approaching sounds of hostile forces breaching the compound's perimeter. "Everyone stay calm." Dr. Vasquez's voice cut through the chaos from somewhere across the main ward. "Follow the emergency procedures we reviewed yesterday." Sarah felt a grim satisfaction that their hasty preparation might make a difference, but she also knew that standard medical emergency procedures wouldn't be sufficient for what was happening. The attacking force was moving with military precision, using coordinated fire and movement techniques that suggested professional training rather than the undisciplined assault of irregular fighters. Through the darkness, Sarah could hear Marcus coordinating the movement of patients to the reinforced areas they had identified during their covert preparations. His voice remained steady as he guided other staff members through procedures that had seemed overly cautious just hours earlier, but now represented their only chance of survival. A second explosion rocked the building as enemy forces destroyed the main communications array, cutting off the hospital's ability to call for help or coordinate with any potential rescue forces. Sarah recognized this as standard military doctrine: isolate the target, eliminate communications, then proceed with the primary assault. The sound of boots on concrete and harsh voices speaking Arabic indicated that hostile forces had entered the hospital building. Sarah's training allowed her to distinguish between at least 3 different speakers, suggesting a minimum assault team of 6 to 8 personnel. Their movement patterns and communication discipline indicated significant military experience. From her position beside the pneumonia patient's bed, Sarah could see muzzle flashes illuminating the main corridor as the attackers moved deeper into the hospital. They were advancing methodically, clearing each room and securing areas behind them as they progressed. This wasn't a simple raid or terrorist attack. It was a military operation designed to capture and hold the facility. "Please, we are medical personnel." Dr. Vasquez's voice carried from the direction of the main ward, followed by harsh commands in Arabic that Sarah's language training allowed her to understand. The attackers were ordering all staff to gather in the central area where they could be controlled and monitored. Sarah faced a decision that she had hoped to avoid. She could follow the orders being given, reveal herself as a civilian nurse, and hope that her apparent non-combatant status would provide some protection. Or she could act on her military training and attempt to neutralize the threat, knowing that doing so would forever shatter the peaceful identity she had worked so hard to build. The decision was made for her when she heard Marcus cry out in pain from the main ward. Through the doorway, she could see one of the attackers striking him with a rifle, but while screaming questions in broken English about American personnel and military advisors at the hospital. Sarah's transformation was instantaneous and complete. The gentle nurse who had spent months caring for wounded civilians vanished, replaced by Chief Petty Officer Sarah Rodriguez, a combat veteran with specialized training in close-quarters battle and hostage rescue operations. Moving with silent precision that had been drilled into her through years of special operations training, Sarah assessed her immediate environment for potential weapons and advantages. A metal 4-stand could serve as an improvised weapon. The medical supply cart provided mobile cover. The patient call system, while damaged, might still function for communication if she could reach the nurse's station. More importantly, Her intimate knowledge of the hospital's layout from months of working within the facility gave her a significant tactical advantage over attackers who were operating from basic reconnaissance. She knew every exit, every supply closet, and every structural feature that could be exploited during close-quarters combat. Sarah's first priority was gathering intelligence about the enemy force. Moving carefully through the darkened corridors, she used her enhanced hearing to track the movements and conversations of the attackers. Her Arabic language skills, developed during multiple deployments to the Middle East, allowed her to understand their communications and tactical planning. From what she could determine, the assault team consisted of 7 fighters with military-grade weapons and equipment. They had divided into 3 elements: 2 fighters securing the perimeter, 3 controlling the staff and patients in the main ward, and 2 conducting a detailed search of the facility for specific targets or intelligence materials. The search pattern suggested they were looking for something more than just a symbolic victory over an international medical facility. Their conversations included references to finding American military personnel or intelligence materials that they believed were hidden within the hospital. Sarah realized that her worst fears were being confirmed. The attackers had intelligence suggesting that the hospital was being used as a cover for military or intelligence operations. They weren't entirely wrong. Her presence represented exactly the kind of hidden military asset they suspected, but their information had led them to attack a genuinely humanitarian facility where her colleagues were innocent civilians. From her concealed position near the supply room, Sarah could see into the main ward where her colleagues were being held. Dr. Vasquez was kneeling beside a wounded patient while 2 armed men kept weapons trained on the assembled staff. Marcus was sitting against a wall holding a cloth to his head where he had been struck, but he appeared alert and was scanning the room in ways that suggested he was looking for opportunities rather than simply accepting their situation. The other nurses and medical technicians showed various levels of fear and shock, but none appeared to be seriously injured. However, Sarah could see that several patients were in distress from being moved during the attack, and at least one elderly man with cardiac problems was showing signs of severe stress that could prove life-threatening without immediate medical attention. The tactical situation was complex, but not impossible. The attackers were confident and disciplined, but they had made the classic mistake of assuming that a medical facility wouldn't contain personnel capable of organized resistance. Their positioning was adequate for controlling frightened civilians, but inadequate for defending against a trained combatant who understood their deployment and capabilities. Sarah's military training provided several options for neutralizing the threat, but each approach carried significant risks to the hostages. A direct assault would almost certainly result in casualties among her colleagues. Attempting to call for outside help was impossible with communications destroyed and no guarantee that friendly forces were within response range. The optimal solution required patience, precision, and the element of surprise that came from being completely underestimated by the enemy. Sarah began moving through the hospital's service corridors and maintenance areas, using routes that she had mentally mapped during her months of working in the facility. Her first objective was to gather intelligence about the external security situation. If the attackers had additional forces positioned around the hospital, or if they were expecting reinforcements, her tactical options would be severely limited. Moving carefully to a window that provided a view of the compound's perimeter, Sarah conducted a visual reconnaissance that confirmed her hopes. The assault team appeared to be operating independently, without external support or overwatch positions. Their vehicles were parked near the main entrance, and no additional personnel were visible in the surrounding area. This suggested either supreme confidence in their ability to control the situation or poor tactical planning that she could exploit. Sarah's next objective was to gather materials that could be used as improvised weapons or tactical equipment. Her medical background had taught her that hospitals contained numerous items that could be repurposed for defensive purposes, and her military training had taught her to see potential weapons in ordinary objects. From the maintenance area, she collected cable ties that could serve as restraints, cleaning chemicals that could create diversions or temporary barriers, and tools that could be used as weapons if necessary. The hospital's backup generator, while damaged, was still partially functional, and could be manipulated to create power failures that would provide tactical advantages. But, most importantly, Sarah began preparing psychological and tactical surprises that would maximize the shock effect when she finally revealed her true capabilities. The success of her planned operation depended not just on her individual skills, but on creating maximum confusion and disruption among attackers who believed they understood and controlled the situation. As she completed her preparations, Sarah could hear increasing agitation in the voices of the attackers. Their search hadn't revealed the American military personnel or intelligence materials they had expected to find, and their frustration was beginning to affect their discipline and patience with the hostages. Through the ventilation system, she heard one of the searchers. Sarah's approach to the main ward was methodical and silent, utilizing movement techniques that had been perfected during urban warfare training. She stayed low, used shadows and cover effectively, and controlled her breathing to minimize any sound that might alert the attackers to her presence. Every step was calculated to bring her closer to a position where she could observe the tactical situation and identify the optimal moment to strike. From her concealed position behind a damaged medical cart, Sarah could see the full deployment of enemy forces within the main ward. Two attackers maintained overwatch positions at opposite ends of the room, while a third moved among the hostages demanding information about American personnel. Their positioning was adequate for intimidating civilians, but created opportunities that a trained operative could exploit. The team leader, identifiable by his more elaborate equipment and the deference shown by the others, was conducting an increasingly aggressive interrogation of Dr. Vasquez. His questions revealed that their intelligence about American military presence at the hospital was specific enough to include details about special operations personnel, though they clearly didn't suspect that their target was already among the hostages. "Where are the American soldiers?" the leader demanded in accented English, pressing his rifle barrel against Dr. Vasquez's temple. "We know they are using this hospital as a base for spy operations. Tell us where they hide their equipment." Dr. Vasquez's response was calm and truthful, though Sarah knew it wouldn't satisfy her interrogator. "This is a humanitarian medical facility. We treat wounded civilians and soldiers without regard to their nationality or political affiliation. There are no military personnel stationed here." The team leader's frustration was evident in his increasingly aggressive body language. Sarah recognized the signs of an operation that wasn't developing according to plan, which made the situation more dangerous for the hostages, but also created opportunities for intervention. Sarah's assessment of the tactical situation identified several critical factors that would influence her approach. The attackers' weapons were positioned in ways that could cause significant collateral damage if firing began in the confined space of the hospital ward. The hostages were grouped together, which simplified control for the enemy, but also made it difficult to engage without risking civilian casualties. Most importantly, the attackers' confidence in their control of the situation had led to relaxed vigilance regarding potential threats from within the facility. They had cleared the hospital upon entry, but weren't maintaining continuous security sweeps, assuming that terrified medical personnel posed no threat to trained fighters. Sarah's plan required exploiting this overconfidence while minimizing risk to the hostages. Her approach would be sequential rather than simultaneous, taking advantage of the attackers' positioning to engage them individually rather than facing the entire team at once. The first target would be the searcher who had separated from the main group to continue looking for intelligence materials in the hospital's administrative area. His isolation made him vulnerable, and removing him would reduce the overall threat while providing Sarah with access to military-grade weapons and equipment. Moving through the hospital's service corridors with practiced stealth, Sarah approached the administrative area where she could hear the searcher methodically going through files and equipment. Her approach was completely silent, utilizing techniques for moving through confined spaces that had been essential during shipboarding operations and urban warfare scenarios. The searcher was focused on his task, confident that the hospital was secure and that no threats existed outside the controlled main ward. This tunnel vision, common among personnel conducting detailed searches, provided Sarah with the opportunity she needed for a close-quarters engagement. Sarah's attack was swift and precisely executed. Using hand-to-hand combat techniques developed for situations where firearms would create too much noise or risk to nearby personnel, she incapacitated the searcher before he could raise an alarm or defend himself. Within seconds, she had acquired his weapon, ammunition, and communication equipment. The radio traffic she monitored confirmed that the assault team was operating independently without external support, but it also revealed that they were on a strict timeline. If they didn't complete their mission and extract within the next 30 minutes, they would abandon the operation and eliminate all witnesses to prevent identification. This timeline created both urgency and opportunity. Sarah knew exactly how much time she had to neutralize the remaining threat, but she also understood that the attackers' extraction deadline would make them increasingly desperate and willing to use extreme violence against the hostages. Sarah's next target was one of the perimeter guards who had been positioned to watch for approaching rescue forces. His location near the hospital's main entrance provided access to the facility's emergency communication system, which might still be functional despite the damage to the primary communications array. The approach required crossing open ground where she might be visible from multiple positions, but Sarah's assessment of the attacker's positioning identified a route that utilized damaged equipment and debris for concealment. Her movement was patient and disciplined, advancing only when she was certain that observation was unlikely. The perimeter guard's attention was focused externally, watching for threats approaching the hospital rather than monitoring for movement within the facility. This external focus, while tactically sound for his assigned mission, created vulnerability to attack from behind. Sarah's engagement with the second target was even more efficient than the first. Her special operations training included extensive work in silent elimination techniques that left targets unable to alert their teammates. Within moments, she had reduced the enemy force by another combatant and gained access to additional equipment and intelligence. The radio communications intercepted from the second target revealed increasing frustration among the remaining attackers. Their search hadn't produced the results their intelligence had promised, and the team leader was beginning to consider more extreme measures to extract information from the hostages. Sarah knew that she was approaching the most dangerous phase of her intervention. The remaining attackers were positioned within the main ward where any engagement would place the hostages at immediate risk. Her approach would need to be perfect, with no margin for error or hesitation. Sarah's final assault on the main ward began with a precisely timed power failure that plunged the area into complete darkness. The sudden loss of lighting created immediate confusion among the attackers, whose night vision had been compromised by the bright emergency lights they had been using to illuminate the hostage area. In the critical seconds of darkness and disorientation that followed, Sarah moved with the fluid precision of someone who had trained extensively for exactly this type of close-quarters combat scenario. The first attacker fell before he could comprehend what was happening. Sarah's approach was completely silent, and her engagement technique eliminated any possibility of warning the others. Her years of special operations training had taught her to move through hostile environments with lethal efficiency, and the confined space of the hospital ward actually worked to her advantage by limiting the attacker's ability to maneuver or establish effective fields of fire. The second attacker managed to fire 3 rounds before Sarah neutralized him, but his shots went wide in the darkness, striking only equipment and walls. The sound of gunfire in the enclosed space was deafening, adding to the chaos and confusion that made it difficult for the remaining hostiles to coordinate their response or identify the source of the attack. Dr. Vasquez's voice cut through the gunfire and shouting, calling for everyone to stay down and remain calm. Her professional composure under extreme pressure helped prevent panic among the hostages, though Sarah could hear the strain in her voice as she tried to understand what was happening in the darkness around them. The team leader's response to the attack on his personnel was professional and immediate. He activated a tactical flashlight and began attempting to establish control of the situation, but his assumptions about the nature of the threat led him to focus on external attackers rather than recognizing that the assault was coming from within the facility. Movement in the East Corridor, he called out in Arabic to his remaining teammate. American soldiers are in the building. Maintain control of the hostages while I eliminate the threat. Sarah understood his tactical assessment and recognized that he was making exactly the mistake she had hoped for. By moving to engage what he believed were external attackers, he was separating himself from his teammate and leaving the hostages under the guard of a single combatant who would now be operating without backup or support. The separated team leader moved through the hospital corridors with professional skill, but Sarah had spent months learning every detail of the facility's layout. Her knowledge of patient rooms, supply closets, and maintenance areas gave her advantages that no amount of military training could overcome. She was fighting on terrain that she knew better than anyone else in the building. The engagement with the team leader was the most challenging of the night. Unlike his teammates, he responded to the unexpected attack with disciplined tactical thinking and effective use of available cover. His movement techniques and fire discipline indicated extensive combat experience, and his equipment suggested elite military training rather than the irregular fighter status that Sarah had initially assumed. But Sarah's advantages in terrain knowledge and tactical surprise ultimately proved decisive. Using the hospital's infrastructure to create multiple engagement opportunities, she was able to force the team leader into a position where his superior equipment and experience couldn't compensate for his unfamiliarity with the environment and his incorrect assumptions about the nature of the threat he was facing. The final engagement lasted less than 90 seconds, but during that time Sarah had to utilize every aspect of her special operations training. Close-quarters marksmanship, tactical movement, and hand-to-hand combat skills all came into play as she maneuvered through the hospital's corridors to neutralize a highly trained opponent who was fighting for his life. When silence finally returned to the hospital, Sarah found herself standing in the main ward with the acquired weapon still in her hands, surrounded by her colleagues who were staring at her with expressions of shock, confusion, and growing understanding. The gentle nurse they had worked with for months had just eliminated an entire assault team with efficiency that spoke of extensive military training and combat experience. Marcus was the first to speak, his voice carrying a mixture of awe and concern. "Sarah, what the hell just happened? Who are you?" Dr. Vasquez slowly stood from her position where she had been protecting a wounded patient during the firefight. Her medical training allowed her to assess the tactical situation quickly and understand that Sarah had single-handedly eliminated all the attackers. But her questions were the same as Marcus's. How could a civilian nurse possess the skills necessary for such an operation? Sarah looked around at her colleagues, realizing that the moment she had hoped to avoid had finally arrived. There was no way to explain what had happened without revealing at least some aspects of her true background. The fiction of Sarah Mitchell, civilian nurse, had been shattered by the reality of Chief Petty Officer Sarah Rodriguez, Special Operations Combat Veteran. "My name is Sarah Rodriguez," she said quietly, setting down the weapon and raising her hands to demonstrate that she posed no threat to her colleagues. "Until 2 years ago, I was a combat medic with a Navy SEAL unit. I came here to try to build a different kind of life. But tonight that past became necessary to protect all of you." The silence that followed her revelation was broken by the sound of approaching helicopters in the distance. Sarah's enhanced hearing allowed her to identify the aircraft as military rather than civilian, suggesting that someone had detected the attack and dispatched a response force. Dr. Vasquez moved towards Sarah with the cautious approach of someone trying to process information that challenged everything she thought she knew about a colleague. "Sarah, or Rodriguez, or whoever you are, why didn't you tell us about your background? We could have requested military protection if we had known there were trained personnel at the facility. Because my presence here was supposed to be completely separate from my military service," Sarah replied. "I created a new identity to escape that life and serve people in a different way. But the intelligence that led to tonight's attack suggests that someone knew or suspected my real background." Marcus approached more directly, his expression showing a mixture of gratitude and confusion. "So when you suggested reviewing our emergency procedures yesterday, you knew this was going to happen?" "I had intelligence suggesting that attacks on medical facilities in this region were being planned," Sarah admitted. "I couldn't share specific details without revealing sources that would have compromised ongoing operations, but I tried to prepare us as much as possible without raising questions about how I knew." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of aircraft landing outside the hospital. Sarah recognized the acoustic signature of military helicopters and knew that her situation was about to become significantly more complicated. If the response force included personnel who might recognize her or have access to classified information about her supposed death 2 years earlier, maintaining any version of her cover story would become impossible. Dr. Vasquez moved to the window and confirmed that armed soldiers were approaching the hospital. Sarah, if your background is classified or sensitive, what are we supposed to tell them about what happened here tonight? Tell them the truth, Sarah replied. A nurse with military medical training was able to neutralize the attackers because of her previous experience. Don't elaborate on the specific nature of that training unless they ask direct questions that require detailed answers. The first soldiers entered the hospital with weapons ready, conducting a tactical sweep to ensure that no additional threats remained. Sarah remained motionless with her hands visible, knowing that her proximity to weapons and evidence of combat would make her an immediate subject of interest for the response team. The team leader, a young lieutenant with infantry insignia, approached Sarah with professional caution. "Ma'am, I need to ask you some questions about what happened here. Are you injured? And do you require medical attention?" "I'm uninjured," Sarah replied. "The attackers have all been neutralized. There are wounded civilians who require immediate medical attention, and the hospital's primary power and communication systems have been damaged." The lieutenant's expression suggested that he was trying to process information that didn't fit his expectations about civilian medical personnel. "Ma'am, the tactical situation here suggests that whoever engaged these attackers had significant military training. Can you explain how the threat was eliminated?" Sarah glanced at her colleagues before responding, knowing that her answer would determine how much of her story would be revealed to official channels. "I have prior military medical training that included some combat instruction. When the hospital was attacked, I was able to use that training to protect the patients and staff." The lieutenant nodded, though his expression suggested that he understood there were significant details being omitted from her explanation. "Ma'am, I'll need to take detailed statements from all personnel, and there will probably be investigators who want to speak with you about your background and the specifics of tonight's engagement." Over the following hours, as medical personnel were evacuated and investigators began processing the scene, Sarah found herself answering increasingly detailed questions about her actions during the attack. Her colleagues provided statements that supported her general explanation while avoiding specifics that they didn't understand themselves. But Sarah knew that the investigation process would eventually reveal more of her background than she wanted to share. Military investigators had access to databases and analytical tools that would make it difficult to maintain the fiction of being a simple nurse with basic military medical training. As dawn broke over the damaged hospital, Sarah sat with Marcus and Dr. Vasquez in a tent that had been set up as a temporary medical facility. The three of them were among the last personnel still awaiting transportation to larger medical facilities where they could continue their humanitarian work. "So what happens now?" Marcus asked, looking at Sarah with an expression that suggested he was still processing the events of the night. "Do you go back to being Sarah Mitchell, civilian nurse, or does Sarah Rodriguez, Navy SEAL, have to resurface officially?" Sarah considered the question, knowing that her answer would depend on factors beyond her control. "I don't know," she said honestly. "A lot depends on how much attention tonight's events generate, and whether official channels decide that my background needs to be investigated more thoroughly." Dr. Vasquez, who had been quietly observing the conversation, finally spoke. "Sarah, regardless of what your official status becomes, I want you to know that what you did tonight saved lives that would have been lost without your intervention. Your colleagues are grateful, even if we're still trying to understand exactly who you really are." As they waited for transportation away from the damaged hospital, Sarah reflected on the transformation that had occurred over the past 24 hours. The peaceful life she had tried to build as a civilian nurse had been shattered, but perhaps that had been inevitable from the moment she decided to work in a conflict zone where her military background might become relevant. The gentle nurse and the lethal warrior had proven to be different aspects of the same person, united by a fundamental commitment to protecting innocent life. Whether she could continue serving as Sarah Mitchell or would be forced to resume her identity as Sarah Rodriguez remained to be seen, but The events of this night had proven that both identities were authentic expressions of who she truly was. The sun rose over a changed landscape, both literally and figuratively, marking the end of one chapter of Sarah's life and the uncertain beginning of whatever would come next. From her new position near the hospital's main entrance, Sarah could see into the ward where her colleagues were being held. The tactical situation had evolved during her engagement with the first two targets, with the attackers becoming more agitated and the hostages showing increasing signs of stress and fear. Marcus caught her eye through the doorway, and Sarah could see his slight nod of recognition. His expression suggested that he understood something significant was happening, though he couldn't know the specific details of her tactical operations. His awareness would be valuable during the final phase of her assault. Sarah's final approach utilized the hospital's damaged electrical system to create tactical advantages. By manipulating circuit breakers and backup power systems, she could control lighting within the main ward while maintaining her own advantages in darkness and concealment. The psychological impact of controlled power failures would add to the confusion and disorientation that she needed to create among the remaining attackers. Their confidence and discipline would be tested by unexpected changes in their environment, creating opportunities for decisive action. As Sarah prepared for the final phase of her operation, she reflected on the transformation that had occurred over the past hour. The gentle nurse who had cared for wounded civilians had become a lethal combatant utilizing skills that most people couldn't imagine. But underneath the tactical mindset and combat techniques, her fundamental motivation remained unchanged, protecting innocent people from those who would harm them. The difference was that she now had the means and opportunity to act on that motivation with deadly efficiency. Sarah checked her acquired weapons and equipment one final time, confirmed her understanding of the tactical situation, and began her approach to the main ward. The remaining attackers were about to discover that their intelligence about American Special Operations personnel at the hospital had been more accurate than they realized, though not in ways they could have anticipated. The final engagement would determine whether her months of careful identity construction had been worthwhile or whether her true nature would be revealed in ways that could never be hidden again. But as she moved toward the confrontation that would save or doom her colleagues, Sarah felt the calm confidence that came from finally being able to use her full capabilities in service of something that truly mattered. The battle for the hospital was reaching its climax, and the outcome would depend entirely on the skills and training that had defined her life before she became Sarah Mitchell, civilian nurse. Chief Petty Officer Sarah Rodriguez was about to complete one final mission, regardless of the consequences for her carefully constructed, peaceful future. Reporting to his team leader that the facility appeared to contain only legitimate medical personnel and equipment. But instead of reducing the threat to the hostages, this discovery seemed to be increasing the attackers' anger and willingness to use violence against people they now viewed as uncooperative sources of information. Sarah knew that the window for peaceful resolution was rapidly closing. If she was going to act, it needed to be soon, before frustration led the attackers to begin executing hostages in an attempt to force cooperation that none of her colleagues could actually provide. Taking a deep breath, Sarah performed the mental transition that she had used countless times during her special operations career. She set aside the emotional connections and personal concerns that defined her civilian identity and embraced the cold tactical mindset that had made her an effective combat operator. The gentle nurse who had spent months earning the trust and affection of her colleagues was about to disappear, possibly forever. In her place would emerge a warrior whose skills and capabilities would save lives, but would also raise questions that could never be fully answered. Sarah checked her improvised equipment one final time and began moving toward the main ward. The battle for the hospital was about to begin, and when it was over, nothing would ever be the same for any of the people involved. By the end of the night shift, they had completed most of the essential preparations. Medical supplies were distributed across multiple secure locations. Staff members had been briefed on updated emergency procedures that included defensive positioning and communication protocols. Backup power and communication systems had been tested and confirmed operational. Dr. Vasquez had approved all of these activities based on Sarah's recommendation for improved emergency preparedness, though Sarah suspected that the doctor was beginning to question why a nurse would have such detailed knowledge of security procedures. As dawn approached, Sarah felt the familiar pre-mission tension that had preceded dangerous operations throughout her military career. The difference was that this time, she was operating without official support, using skills that she couldn't acknowledge to protect people who didn't understand the nature of the threat they faced. The morning sun created long shadows across the hospital compound as Sarah completed her final security check. Everything that could be done through covert preparation had been accomplished. The hospital was as ready as it could be for an attack, though the staff remained largely unaware of the specific danger they might face. But, as she watched the sunrise paint the surrounding hills with golden light, Sarah knew that all the preparation in the world might not be enough if her suspicions about the timing and nature of the coming attack proved accurate. Soon, she might have to choose between maintaining her carefully constructed identity and taking actions that would reveal exactly who and what she really was. The process had been facilitated by contacts within the intelligence community who understood the need for certain personnel to disappear completely from their previous lives. Sarah Elena Rodriguez had been officially killed in action during a classified operation, while Sarah Mitchell had emerged with perfectly crafted documentation and a believable history in civilian emergency medicine. The irony wasn't lost on her that she had traded one form of dangerous service for another. Working in conflict zones as a civilian medical volunteer carried significant risks, but it provided the sense of purpose and meaning that she had struggled to find in ordinary civilian life. Here, her skills mattered, lives were saved through her efforts, and the constant underlying tension felt familiar rather than overwhelming. As dawn approached, and the hospital began stirring with the start of another day, Sarah completed her rounds and prepared to brief the incoming day shift. She had successfully maintained her cover for another night, providing medical care while keeping her true capabilities hidden from colleagues who had become like family to her. But, deep in her mind, the observational skills that had been honed through years of special operations training continued to process information that troubled her. The enemy activity in the region was increasing, local security was inadequate, and the hospital's position made it vulnerable to attack. These concerns weighed heavily on her as she prepared to face another day of maintaining her carefully constructed fiction while knowing that very real threats were building just beyond the horizon. The morning sun cast new shadows across the hospital compound as Sarah finally allowed herself a brief moment of rest. She closed her eyes and tried to push away the nagging feeling that her two worlds, the secret past she had left behind and the peaceful present she was trying to build, were about to collide in ways that would test every aspect of her carefully maintained deception. And nothing would ever be the same again.